Welcome back, everybody. The last session on the last day, so let's all hang in there. We've got a really exciting lineup. Thank you. An exciting lineup on sustainability, climate change, and gender. We're going to start with Jheelum. So I'll hand it over to you.
I think so, yeah.
Am I audible? Oh,
Yes.
Okay. Hi, I'm Jheelum, and I'm a third-year PhD student at American University. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to present my work in progress. So I'm looking into the impact of climate shocks on gender division of paid and unpaid labor using Indian time use survey and focusing on coastal hotspot, Kerala. So according to the latest report by IPCC, in next 2 to 3 decades, we are going to experience a surge in in average temperature by 1.5 degrees Celsius, which means that climate extremes like droughts, flash floods, heat waves are going to become more frequent. And in particular in India, according to CEW, more than 75% of districts are vulnerable to climate shocks, specifically floods and droughts. So when we talk about climate change, there is an emerging literature on climate and gender that looks into how climate is associated with gender-based violence, health, and recently labor. One of the areas that I believe is overlooked in the literature of climate and gender is the gender division of labor. And especially like the cutting edge relationship between the unpaid and paid labor. Sorry, yeah. So according to the 2019 Indian Time Use Survey, more than 80% of Indian women spends above 8 hours per day on unpaid domestic and care work. At the same time, according to the World Bank Gender Portal, nearly like 60% gender gap persists in the labor force participation. So these two phenomena are not like coincident, they're related. Globally, more than 40% of women leave paid jobs because of their unpaid labor responsibilities. So a little about how I link these two concepts like the climate shocks and gender division of labor. So climate change, whether it's a slowly changing or a short-term climate extremes, directly affects our lives in 3 different mechanisms. Directly first through loss in physical and natural assets, and then like affecting health of vulnerable population subgroups, primarily children, older population and women through airborne and vector-borne diseases, and also through changing livelihood and opportunities and income levels. So the limited accessibility to natural resources after the floods and also to disruptions in the income levels and income sources can influence an individual's bargaining power, especially for women. In India, most of the women are engaged in agricultural sector and informal sectors, which are highly vulnerable to any kind of shocks, be it environment or economic. So my hypothesis is the social norms interact with climate shocks. By climate shocks, I mean the direct effects of climate extremes on these 3 channels, and that in turn impacts the gender division of unpaid and paid labor. So a little about theoretical framework. I would go into the details of it since I have to explain so many like the symbols I have used, and it will take up lots of time. So I'm using the collective bargaining model by Shiapuri. And why I'm using the collective bargaining model is because individuals are not uniform within a household. So whatever be their utility attached to a person within a household comes at unequal weights, which according to the collective bargaining model is the Pareto weights, they call it. And the decision making is the Pareto efficient. I'm not using the non-cooperative bargaining model because in the Indian society, like especially a household, a typical household is not like of their own self-interest. They have to look at what is the well-being, like in inverted commas, well-being of the overall household. So that's the rationale for using this model. And so my model is like the time, like the share of time is allocated across three sectors: the paid work, unpaid household work, and leisure. So in a 2% model, the utility functions of male and female is the utility derived from consumption, household production, and leisure, and traditional way as to like disability from labor, like the paid labors as well. But in case of women, there is an additional disability from unpaid, labor in unpaid household work, that is the DF. So this is based on a very simplistic assumption is that unlike men, women experience disability from unpaid household work due to social norms. They have to give up lots of opportunity costs associated with it. So so I did some utility maximization problem. There is a weighted utility of husband and wife regarding the bargaining power measure, subject to the the usual budget constraint, consumption being less than or equals to income, and also household production function. And then on the production side, I have taken like the Cobb-Douglas production function, which is a function of like the labor given by men and women and capital. And then I did some like the profit maximization thing, which gives me that at optimum wages are equal for both the genders, which again is not true in real life, but this is in a very simplistic way to give me the mechanism behind like how climate shocks interact with the wages and the bargaining power to influence the paid labor force supply and unpaid household labor demand. So the findings after doing some like utility maximization, the first order conditions and all, that gave me a 10 by 10 matrix, which is really difficult for me to solve at present. But by utilizing various literatures on household bargaining model and time use papers based on time use, like for unpaid and paid labor, and some like normalization gave me the following result that climate shocks interact with wages, like the equilibrium wage, and bargaining power to influence not only outside labor, but also the unpaid household labor. So this is my the case study. So what happened was in August 2019, the average rainfall in Kerala exceeded 100% than usual, which directly affected lives of 200,000 individuals. And there was a widespread damages, like more than 15,000 houses were underwater. And in fact, critical infrastructure facilities, including airport, was also like damaged. There was huge losses in the climate sensitive sectors, primarily agriculture and fishery. About 67% of affected land, like the affected cropped areas, which has more than 33% of cropped areas were adversely affected, and more than 7,000 hectares of fish farms were impacted. So Kerala has a really good data, I would say, the disaster management handbooks, but there were information by district level damages. However, it was not explicitly mentioned that vis-a-vis which districts were worse impacted compared to the other. So I utilized the principal component analysis to compute the district-wise scores of the damages. And then I classified the affected districts colored as blue as the one with more than 20% damage as the affected districts, and below 20% damages as the unaffected districts colored green. And you can see there is a gray colored district called Idduki. Why I colored it gray? Because I'm excluding it from my analysis since it doesn't have data in one of the sub-rounds that I need to include for my analysis. So data source, I'm using the 2019 Indian Time is data source, which includes nearly 138,800 households and more than 400,000 individuals aged 6 and above. So it was basically the weighted sample, not the real sample, I'd say. And the data was collected in 4 sub-rounds. So January to March, April to June, July to September, and October to December. So the first 2 sub-rounds are my pre-event period data, and the last data is my post-event period since the event occurred in August. And the rationale for using the time use survey is because I believe that the basic measure of resilience is our own behavior, which we sort of reallocate in terms of the time use between different sectors when we do not have any external support. And that is like the case what people have when they experience a sudden sort of shock. So my focus is on Kerala, the married individuals, married men and women. And yeah, so for my method of estimation, I'm using the difference in different strategies so as to compare like the time spent on unpaid and paid work between married men and women located in treatment and control districts. So my main outcome variables is unpaid household work and paid labor force participation. And key independent variable is the shock, which is the interaction of the time and treatment dummy. And the coefficient of interest is beta 1. So for controls, I'm including the individual levels control, age, education, occupation, household controls, religion, caste, household expenses, dependency ratio, sex ratio, and also some of the household assets like the type of washing clothes, whether it's mechanized, outsourced, or done by manual, and same for sweeping floor and sources of cooking energy. So I will go to the summary statistics. It's in the paper. If you want to clarify, I can do it. Just go quickly to the results. So like the parallel trend assumption that shows that in absence of any shock, the differences between the underlying differences between the affected and unaffected districts would remain constant. And that's what I found it here. So what I did, I utilized the 2 pre-period event data and like created a dummy as 0 and 1 for one of the pre-event and did the same regressions. And the coefficients are statistically insignificant. That means like my parallel trend assumption holds. And this is my key results with respect to married women. So as I increase like the individual controls, household controls, and include the district fixed effects, the time spent by married women increases like varies between 11 hours per week to 14 hours per week. And remember that the mean time by the control group on unpaid household work is 53 hours per week. So that means those who are in the affected districts, they're like around 70 hours per week. It should increase. And by married men, the average time that the men control group spends is like around 9 hours. And they also experience a rise in the unpaid household labor between like around 6 hours per week. So it means like around 15 hours per week. But still it's a disproportionately worse off for women. And surprisingly, the paid labor, women increases the time spent on paid labor by around 3 hours per week, which is statistically insignificant for men. And it's negative, but it's statistically insignificant. So one of the reasons I believe is like in Kerala, there is a huge amount of out migration by men. So maybe like the households which are being surveyed or included, they have some main earning members already outside, and or there can be some other sectoral transition from agriculture to non-agriculture, and which is difficult to like capture using a like short-term analysis, because I just have a 3-month period data after the event happened. But some potential mechanisms that I tried to identify, I just like made a composite table excluding like the other names of the controls to give you an idea about the coefficients. So one, I believe that if they have time-saving assets, say like the way they wash like the clothes or sweep the floors, whether it is mechanized or outsourced, then that is like time-saving. And if it's manual, then it's not, like they are worse off. So in that case, I have seen the coefficients to be quite large for women. It's like their unpaid household labor declines by nearly 16 hours per week, but it is not statistically significant. So one reason can be the households who have those advantages are usually like well off, and so they are not like substantially impacted by the climate shock. So that can be a factor, or the kind of unpaid household activities which are usually like demands more labor are probably some activities that cannot be solved using time-saving mechanisms, say caregiving responsibilities. So if you look at the last row, that is where my caregiving responsibilities case. So when I interacted the shock variable with the caregiving dummy, like if they have to like provide care for children, disabled or elderly, then the unpaid household climate-induced unpaid labor increases by 10.2 hours per week, and their women's paid labor declines by 3.45 hours per week. If you remember, when I did not included this heterogeneity, the climate shock increases women's paid labor force by 3 hours, and it exactly falls by that amount when I introduce the caregiving channel. And lastly, I tried to see whether marital status is also a kind of social cost that women and men face. So if you look at the second row, for when I compare between the married and unmarried women, time spent after the climate shock by married women increases by nearly 14 hours per week in affected districts. And for men, it increases by 5 hours per week, but the effects are not significant in terms of paid labor force participation. So also I did some robustness check. I excluded the border treatment districts to control for the fact that people may migrate into the nearby unaffected areas after the event happened. So the white districts are the ones I excluded from my analysis, but the results didn't change significantly. And similarly, I also tried to see the districts with highest shares of poor families, but the results remained like largely consistent. And yeah, like I'm running out of time. So the only limitation is like it's a year-wide data. I do not have data beyond like the December 2019. Otherwise, I would like to try to see if the social norms changes to certain extent, like structural transformation after climate change event. And for further steps, I'm trying to look for mechanisms like age groups and social group, like the caste hierarchy, whether those matters or not. And also I'm interested in integrating like periodic labor force service to account for migration for men, if that can be a potential mechanism behind the statistically insignificant results. And also in 2018, there was a massive flood in Kerala. So I need to check whether there was some long-run implications for the affected and unaffected districts in 2019 or not. But because Kerala had a good relief package schemes that they like go forth after certain like climate shocks happen. So I believe that the impact would diminish by the time the timely service started. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks so much. So Sophia is joining us on Zoom. So maybe she can hear us. Sophia.
Hello, yes, I'm here.
Ah, great.
Hello.
So please go ahead and give some discussion comments, Sophia.
Okay.
And we will plan on maybe 7 or so minutes, if that's okay.
Sure, that will be fine. Yeah.
Thank you.
So yeah, I'd like to just start by saying that I really welcome this study. You know, we have we know as a result of qualitative research that women's workloads increase as a result of climate impacts, but there's very little quantitative analysis of this. And so while this obviously was a survey undertaken for other reasons, it's really good to see this kind of data being used in a way to start to get to a really concrete understanding of how climate change impacts women and men and their workloads. So I also like the fact that this is put in the context of gender norms, social norms, an understanding that climate effects may have some impact on gender-based violence, although we haven't seen a lot of that in this study. So if that's part of the context, it would be good to see whether this can be looked at in some way or not. And then also that intersectionality is going to be going to be more of a part of the analysis in taking into account social group, age, the issue of migration as well. As we know, we know very well, and South Asia is one area where this is a real factor. Climate is causing migration, primarily of men, and to urban areas and other countries for employment. And so we're finding in rural areas that women's workload is increasing significantly, substantially, as they have more work to do in terms of recovering from climate shocks, but then also taking on the work that their husbands had done before. And so I would at this point like to say this is missing, I think, from this analysis. I know Kerala is a bit more of a what's the word, affluent area of India, but there still are there is still a significant rural population. And I think that any assessment of the impacts of climate change on women's work really does need to take into account migration. As well, it does need to take into account rural, and that's related to migration, the rural-urban location. And so I would suggest that there be some additional disaggregation as well in terms of geographic location or regional location. And I saw that some of the, you took out some of the provinces in terms of this analysis. And so I suggest that for the next iteration or in revisions, you justify and rationalize why you're including some provinces and not other provinces, and the effects of some of these other issues on women's workloads. Okay, that's part of it. So just to get to some key some specific comments. It's really impressive to see this database that you're using. And so that's an exciting set of data. It's an exciting, bite to take off. And so I encourage you to continue to do some of this disaggregation as much as possible with the data, because there is a lot in there that could really contribute to our understanding of how this affects women and men. One of the comments I have is that it might be helpful to have a table that breaks down a little bit some of the differences in terms of paid labor and unpaid labor. And, in some cases, you're saying that unpaid household work increases differentially for both. And then in other cases, you're saying that there's an insignificant decrease or a different decrease. And so it would be helpful if you could line that up in a table to show us, compare the numbers. In which situation is this increasing versus unpaid versus paid, but also in terms of kind of aggregating the data so that we get a sense of the hours per week that women and men are gaining or losing in terms of paid and unpaid labor as well. That would help us have a better picture of how this is affecting how this is affecting the population. The other comment I would make is to be a little more clear about some of the contextual literature that you've cited. You clearly understand the literature on this, and clearly there's a really interesting set of literature on women's and men's roles in the household, unpaid versus paid work, domestic work and child work care and so forth, but it does tend to be based in the global north. And so it would be, I think it would add to the interest if you would make more clear that which research you're referencing or using that is been done in the global north and which has been done in Asia or in South Asia. And then your work could contribute to understanding whether there are differences or similarities. Because, one of the differences I would mention right now would be in South Asia and India, and of course this is changing to a certain extent. There is more a tradition of hiring work to help with some of the domestic tasks than there is in the global north. And so how this affects unpaid work and gender division of labor, as well as other social norms in the region and how those affect the division of labor. I think it could be useful to kind of get at that a little bit more in detail and to look at the differences. The other question I have, and I understand this is because of the database that you're working with, but it seems that the economics term is unpaid labor, or household labor. And yet globally, we are moving more towards the terminology of unpaid care work. And the definition that you include here is obviously set by the India survey and the government department that set it up. But in rural areas in particular, women's unpaid care work also expands to other activities, household, agriculture, water management, irrigation, perhaps even in the cities in terms of flooding, there would be cleaning up streets or cleaning up basements or things like that. And so it would be useful, perhaps in the conclusion, for you to kind of spell out those issues in terms of we need to expand our understanding of what women's unpaid care work or unpaid labor involves, and it's not just restricted to work in the household and domestic duties, but in fact expands to a larger range of activities that women do to maintain their family and to maintain their activities to support the family, as well as gain income at times to support the family. So that could be an interesting discussion to have in the conclusion. You might know that UN Women has recently published an info note or a policy brief on unpaid care work and environmental issues in the Global South, and how women's work involves these broader range of activities, and women's unpaid care work involves those broader range of activities. And that could be a really interesting discussion in terms of looking at what do we want to look at in the future. So
I'm going to pause you there.
Comments?
Great. Wonderful, thank you. Just wanted to make sure we have time for your presentation at the end, and also Hossein, who'll present next. So I'll turn the floor over to him.
So thank you. You're tired, guys, right? See already some faces are really like. Yeah, you know, there is a saying, you say if you have an event like this, the first day the presenters talk well, audience also understand. The second day presenters talk well, audience are lost. And the third day, which is the case, either the presenters, they don't know what they are talking about. So, I hope we can make it well today. And I don't know why you put me at the end of the list. Even my family name start with A. I always in my whole life the first one to be called, except today. But okay, let's see. Oh yeah. Yeah. Anyhow, very much happy to be here for the very first time. I didn't know about this institute and the very well organized workshop. Thank you. So I'm Hossein Azadi. I'm a professor at the University of Liège in Belgium. My work is a little bit of, let's say, multidisciplinary, maybe given my 2 PhDs. First was in agricultural economics and the second geography. So it's kind of having a little bit of here and there and mixing, combining everything to understand what is going on. Okay, let's, I know that you are tired, okay, I'll make it short. Although I will be trying to make it with a little bit of action so that you feel a little bit energy. So let's look at the causes and effects of climate change. I know that you all already know about that. Just let me click on this link and look at how it works. Yeah, that is working. And you see that is the current population right now that we are having. So with this fast number, so what should we do? This means that a lot of pressure on our resources, right? A lot of pressure. And we know that in every second you put, we are producing more human and putting more pressure. And then it's even more crazy when we see that, okay, our resources are more and more limited, right? And out of, half of this number are female. So That's the point. Let's continue. Can we get back to the slides? Okay.
Nobody dies.
Well, there is if you continue, scroll down further down, you will. So I actually liked a lot the talk of Harun yesterday, talking about the limited resources what we have. And that's why I'm trying to say that, okay, this huge population needs a lot of resources. And well, when we say a lot of resources, when we come to gender, then we see that females are having limited access. And there is the problem. Why? Because there we have, especially in the rural area, what we see that, okay, how we can solve the problem. And then it's important just to give you a little bit of warm up that, okay, that when we go for a gender gap, when it comes to economic opportunities, we see that 68% is already closed, but still we have a lot to do, because if we keep the same pace, then we will need like 170 years to close all this gap. This already talks a lot. So especially when we go to the rural area where actually I work, then you will see that, okay, this is a more important, let's say, a bigger challenge. And then, of course, when we look at the SDGs, they are supposed to close everything by 2030. So this is ridiculous. So this is not reality. The reality is saying something else. And then we go for, let's say, the role of female in all these, how we can make climate change adaptation, mitigation, resilience, blah, blah. By the way, I was being asked a lot since the day one of this workshop. Okay, what is the difference between mitigation, adaptation, resilience, stuff like that. And because I also need that for my talk, let me just make it a little bit, clear here. When we say adaptation, climate change adaptation and mitigation, just to make it clear, we have already experienced on the code, right? So who got positive? Myself. And everyone, okay? But some, when we got COVID, what happened? You received some medications, perhaps, some special diet, right? Or like immediate actions you have to do. So the incident already happened to you, and you have to take some action to adapt to the new situation. That is adaptation. So we are going to cure something which is already happening. Okay, so this is adaptation. But when we come to mitigation, what happens? You are trying to prevent, like what in COVID? Vaccination or travel ban. And it's also important to note why, because this adaptation is more to micro level and it's more individual based, because the prescription for you might be different than for me. But when we go for mitigation, it's more macro level, more policy level that actually applies to everyone, like vaccination for the whole country or travel ban. Why I'm saying that? Because in this study, we focused on adaptation, so more to the micro level, more to the end user, more to the human factor-based actions. And then we have resilience here. I don't know, when we talk about climate resilience, climate change resilience, blah, blah, but it's rather vague. When I ask my students, they don't know what is the concept. Let's make it clear, okay, a little bit of action. So do you have a pen for me? I'm going to just break it down. Be careful, not this one. Okay, this one. Because I just need one spring. I'm going to break it down.
Okay.
So the resilience, if I stretch this spring, it gets back, right? it is resilient so far, right? Right. I stretch it more and more. To some extent, it's broken. Resilient is gone. So this means that your pen is broken. This means that we do need this resilience capacity if we have climate change incident, right? The more we have this capacity, then we better can deal with, we better can bear with that, right? And then we have tipping point. What's that? The tipping point. Any voluntary? I'm gonna break my back. So look at this. The tipping point. Have to be careful. Oh, 911. Okay, so.
Say that you're not sure to.
Because you guys are sleeping, I have to wake you up. At some point, it fell. So this is how it is. Why we are speaking about all this capacity? Because in fact, the adaptive capacity is all about resilience and how we can postpone the tipping point. Then you have to call 911. I'm happy you liked it at least. So the adaptive capacity is all about that. How we can have the tipping point delayed so that we can have more time to deal with. Okay, and then it's more important, again, coming back to what Harun said, and now I'm a fan of Harun. So you see that, okay, we have the different resources here. So we say when we have the limited access to these resources, and when we have a lot of pressure on these resources, then we have to do something, especially when it comes to the gender issue, who have limited access. Okay, 5 minutes. Ooh, okay, 40% of the 40% of in agri-rural development and in the rural sector, you see that they are actually active. The job is done by the ladies, and then we go for my research finally, because we try to see how different studies looked at gender issue when it comes to climate change, adaptive capacity, or coping mechanism. We started with like the 3,000 articles and ended up with 143. It was a kind of meta-analysis, by the way. And then you can see, and we're going to be quick, and you see that there are some variables that we consider as adaptive capacity, coping capacities, and then we consider how it could be based on male and female, but also based on different continents. Why we try to make it based on gender, that is obvious, but why per continent? Because the access and how resources are governed normally in different regions could be different. They could have different stories. And you see here, well, it was in the beginning kind of surprised that you see that female, they have less adaptive capacity. But then when you consider their limited access to resources, then you see that, okay, that explains the fact why it happens. And then more important than that, let me just go to here. You see, with the studies that were done in Asia, you see that they consider more social issues compared to African studies. They consider more farming-related issues, more technical, more technology, more resources. But then, let me just come here. You see that in Europe and Oceania, you have a better capacity when it comes to gender. Why? Because the resources are better governed. And even gender is better governed. So the rights, everything. So you see that also explains what, again, Harun said, that the limited access to resources can actually make a difference. And then I should add something here because Jheelum, the previous presentation just mentioned that the articles are more and more focusing on gender issues. This is exactly what we noticed, because since 2020, then you see more and more this gender issue is popping up. The rest is just having, I'm finished.
It says 2 minutes.
Okay, anyhow, I'm
Okay.
finished. Okay. So I mean, what we can consider, okay, that to improve the situation, the main job, to my understanding, and in fact, I was and I'm still hoping that somewhere we hear more about governance issues, because we talked a lot how all this is governed. Because governance issue is kind of a very complex issue and very subjective, and it needs a lot of work. And it's a lot of multidisciplinary science. I mean, you need anthropologists, you need lawyers, you need agriculture, for example, if it comes to the rural area, environmentalists, so many, even geographers. So I mean, then combining all this, and that was my point when I asked our keynote speaker, because this is not easy and it takes time. But when we spoke about, for example, some, let's say, hard indicators like GDP, it's easy to measure. And of course, it can talk a little bit. But when it comes to governance, I'm sure if I ask everybody here could perhaps give different definition of governance. But GDP, no, it's very robust. So what I'm just trying to tell you is that, okay, the governance or gender governance should be on the table, should be working, and it should be in the agenda of all policymakers. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much. So we'll have Jheelum come back up for some discussion comments.
Yeah. Thank you for the presentation. It was great and entertaining. I really enjoyed reading the paper. I'll just quickly go by what I have. So the objective of the paper is to look into the adaptation capacity and how is it linked to the gender. The authors measured the adaptation capacity under like 4 ways. One is the capacity making, so how men and women differ in building their resilience, and what is the role of gender in managing systems to cope with environmental changes, and also the role of exogenous support systems and resources to generate adaptation efforts, and importantly, adaptation actions, like what are implementation based on the land use and access, and what is the role of gender in it. So another interesting part of the paper's objective is to focus on the spatial temporal patterns of gender. So what they mean by that is they identify how gender shapes each of these strategies over time and across various regions. That is sort of going to give us some idea about like a general conclusions about what is happening in all these continents and how is it different between like the developing and less developed world. And also like the time-based variations in gender responses. So the process in which the literature review is done are like 5 steps. Firstly, the scoping, and then they went by like the keyword specifications, like and also the search criteria, title and abstract review, and article selection. So the keywords that they use is like the gender, female, adaptation, adaptive capacity, agricultural sectoral management, land adaptation actions, livelihood assets. And also the search period was from 1990 to 2024. So that's really impressive. because it will give us some long run, like how is it transforming over time. And yeah, so interesting findings. Gender significantly affects adaptation strategies across Africa, Asia, Europe, Oceania. And interestingly, while like being female and all these adaptation strategies is negatively associated, interestingly, livelihood assets play a smaller role in adaptation strategies. So that was interesting. And also they utilized 2020 as like a time factor, whether it's how is it varying like before 2020 and after 2020. So some of my comments is they have like these dependent variables of various like adaptation capacity, management systems, and land adaptation mechanisms. So I could not find any explicit definitions of these strategies in the paper. Maybe, I mean, I tried to look into it. I provided what I could best understand from it, but I think it will be beneficial if you can write it in a simpler words, like so that a wider audience can have some idea of what's going on and how is this each individual terms are being measured. There are certain definitions being provided, but similar words have been repeated in it. And also, I would say that the dependent variable was with respect to being female. So maybe you can also try to introduce what are the coping strategies by males to capture the gender differences. So that's one. And so there was gender scenario variables, which is like male and female impacting strategic adaptation that's been mentioned. But because the dependent variables are already like segregated by gender, that whether certain adaptation strategies being incorporated by male or female. So I think like either you take out that out of it or like utilize this, because I would suggest that the dependent variable is good enough. We need to move into like gender-based research beyond dummies. In this case, I would suggest that instead of taking the individual sample, like individuals within the sample, their gender, I would suggest that take the scenario variable as gender of the authors. Like if it's a female author, what they're focusing on and what not in your meta-analysis. And also, I wanted to know what is the rationale behind utilizing 2020 as the threshold. If you have certain reasoning to include it, then it would be better if you explicitly state that. Otherwise, I believe that if COVID is an important factor in it, then I would suggest to try to search some studies that capture the intersection between the climate change and COVID, because lack of financial, like the COVID shocks can also impact an individual's resources and also the adaptation strategies. And some generic suggestions. I would like to see some mechanisms behind why just being male and female influenced adaptation capacities. I believe there are a number of studies that, especially the qualitative ones, that look into the factors that influence men and women's like varying adaptation strategies, limited resources, or other like ownership of assets and various other things. So yeah, so like if no reasonings are provided in the empirical studies that you have mentioned, you should definitely take a look into the qualitative studies and may include the findings from there, which are always some interviews from various participants in the hotspot regions, because information lies beyond numbers. And maybe I would say that in the discussion sections, it would be great if you can identify some policy papers or briefs that can connect like the gendered effects and adaptation strategies and what is the role of policies in it. So I attached a link to one policy paper I found interesting. So if you're up to it, I can send that. Thank you.
Wonderful. So now we'll turn to Sophia. And Sophia, I'm sorry you're not here and I can't hold up the pieces of paper that have the minutes left, but I'll leave it to you to kind of keep the 15-minute time. So thank you.
Okay. All right. Let me share my screen. I can find it here. Okay. Okay, so this is a review, I guess, or an overview summary of experience that we've had in the CGIAR program called Accelerating the Impact of CGIAR Climate Research for Africa. And this is a kind of an overview of some of the gender and social inclusion work that we've been doing over the years. So we've seen already risks for Africa and the risks of climate change. So I won't spend too much time on this, but we see a lot of health issues, reduced food production, biodiversity loss, and so forth. And as we know, women's work tends to be focused in natural environment, in unpaid work, in caring for the family, which includes food procurement, food gathering, managing water resources, collecting water and energy sources, managing local gardens, in times of stress, going into the wild environment for wild foods, managing and collecting medicinal plants and so forth. So women interact very closely with the environment in many of their tasks across the global south. And so they're very closely impacted by climate effects. This is a nice example from Malawi, I believe it is. Yes, Malawi, that shows the kind of issues that women experience in times of drought, increased temperature, floods, and rainfall variability. So there are direct impacts as well as indirect impacts, and there may be direct physical harms or stress. There are stresses, of course, to the family and to the household or to the house structure. Increased health problems result, such as malaria, sanitation issues with water that has been affected. And so that there will be increased stress on women and girls and children's human labor in responding to the stresses and the shocks, as well as in attempting to resurrect and regenerate their income generation and their household activities. All of these climate impacts affect crop production and can either cause crops to fail, be reduced in production, or destroyed. And in those cases, they may need to be replanted, or families may need to go to the market to buy foods to make up for the crop production problems. And again, water quality and quantity are also affected, increasing need for irrigation, as well as affecting health and disease. So we know that women and children, and especially girls, carry out most of the farming activities and household chores around the house. So they're most affected by these effects and become vulnerable to not only food insecurity, but there are health implications, as well as increases in labor loads. And as I mentioned in my previous comments, migration of family members to urban areas or other countries will then increase their labor loads as well. So the CGIAR has, over the past 8 years that I've been involved with them, we've been looking at how do these climate impacts relate to women, and are there specific impacts that affect women? And thanks to our previous speaker, sorry, I forget your name, but you set the context really, really well, so that I don't have to really explain how that women have different adaptive results and adaptive options, and less access to adaptive resources. So we've been looking at resilience and adaptive capacity in the context of climate change in the same context as we've just seen so well illustrated in our previous presentation. But we're talking here about the capacity of communities or households to resist, cope with, or recover from these shocks and improve their situation. So arrive at a state of reduced or diminished vulnerability. And so, we make the point that in this case, if you're looking at gender equality in the context of climate change, you need to understand and need to integrate the concept of climate resilience or reduced vulnerability, and the ability of women and men in both rural and urban contexts to have the resources, be they financial, be they human labor, be they improvements in production, be they irrigation, be they, all of that. They need that to be able to respond to and recover from climate impacts, be it indigenous knowledge and knowledge of local biodiversity to substitute for crops or medicines that are no longer available. So all of this is really important in terms of gender equality so that women can meet the needs of their families, meet their own needs, and not be kind of constantly going back and recovering and rebuilding and so forth from climate impacts in various ways. So on top of that, we add the concept of women's agency in terms of Kabir's comment on women's agency as the ability to access and act on information and participate in decisions that affect their lives. I'm sorry, were you going to say something? Okay. So in this view, we're taking the view that gender equality in relation to climate adaptation and resilience includes resilience for agriculture and food security, so ability to adapt and adopt agricultural practices that increase their production and are sustainable and can resist climate impacts, climate information that's targeted to women's priorities, participation in community level decision making and leadership in regards to climate impacts and responses, but building resilience and other issues and decreasing their workloads. So we have developed a bit of a framework to look at this, and so the following case studies that I'm about to present look at one or more of these 4 or 5 factors in terms of gender equality and climate resilience. So the ability to increase income and production not only around the household, but in the family farm, so in the face of climate impacts, access and control of technologies, farm inputs and assets that will support women's production around the household and again on the farm, access to climate information so that they can plan for the season or the next day or the next week. So for example, they know when it's going to rain, so that they can either put off planting or plant before it's raining and so forth. Access to credit and finance, of course, decreases in their workload and the ability to increase the health of their families or increase dietary diversity. So our approach as well to equality and empowerment is we're not talking about empowerment yet because empowerment is a process, but we're looking at participation in decision-making and leadership as a proxy for, a good signal towards empowerment or exercising empowerment in certain situations. And we have found in our work, as is found elsewhere, that women's collective action in the form of self-help groups, producer groups, women's organizations, collective savings, etc., are often act as a platform for women to mobilize, to combine resources and to express their agency. So I'll just show you, just talk briefly about some of the cases that we've seen. In Mali, and Africa Rice is focuses, as its name implies, on rice production in Africa. Women do not tend to be the producers here. Women are the food processors, the rice processors. So they parboil the rice before it's sold to market. So what the project here included the introduction of an improved parboiling technology that reduced the amount of fuel required, reduced the time for the parboiling, reduced the workloads on women, and produced a better quality of rice. So that was kind of like the basic technology introduction to improve the product and reduce the workloads. And then on top of that, they worked with the Women's Association that was managing the parboiling to set up an association or a group enterprise to market the product, the rice, and bring it to market, brand it, and sell and develop different products out of the rice to increase their incomes. And so this picture this picture at the bottom here is a picture of the Women's Parboiling Association and their products, which were delicious. Let me tell you, that was at a conference last year. And they made a Rice Krispie that really doesn't need milk or sugar or anything else. It's just tastes so good. And they had like 5 other products as well, based in rice. that they were presenting at a conference and presenting to, the local ministry officials and so forth in Burkina Faso. So, it contributed to their empowerment, increasing their production and their quality of food, but it also, gave them a sense of confidence and achievement and accomplishment in increasing their production, improving the production, and running this organization that was successful. In Senegal, this group of women formed a group to process baobab. And now in Senegal, if you live in Senegal, you'll see you can buy this baobab fruit juice powder everywhere. It's delicious, it's healthy. And it also, in this community, helped the community to understand the need to keep the baobab healthy as kind of a pillar in the local ecosystem. What they were doing was stripping the leaves to feed the livestock. So the group worked with the community to understand the value in general of environmental restoration, but also helping them realize an economic return on processing the rice, the baobab powder. So this has been a successful initiative for the women's group in this region. They have taken over the marketing, the income management, and they have now also become part of the community environmental management committee because of their connection to working with the baobabs. And so now there's a local environment committee that manages how the natural resources around the village are used, and the women are part of that. They have set up a village savings pool to invest in community resilience activities, and they have, taken a greater role in general in their community. So. Now, there are some aspects that they'll talk about later. In Ghana, they worked with a village savings and loans association. The women in the community, in one of their communities, were very interested in picking up new approaches, climate resilient agricultural approaches that would increase their production. For example, cowpea production, managing pests, post-harvest storage and processing, but they didn't have the money to do it. They didn't have the resources to invest or to try new things or buy or even buy manure, actually. So they were very cash starved. So they set up a village savings and loan association as kind of a collective savings group, so that they were able to access some of these technologies that are listed here. And they also instituted radio listening groups to listen to climate information and agro advisories. So this significantly increased their access to information on weather, but as well as on other aspects to increase their income, increase their production. So now they're selling more in the market, as well as to increase their confidence. And so we were in Ghana a couple of years ago to meet with the village and to meet with the producers, and several women from the women's producer group stood up, which was a new group formed out of our project. And later we found that this was the first time any woman had ever spoken in a public gathering in the village. And so and in this particular case, I think 2 or 3 of them stood up to speak about their experience. And I think this is the last one. In Zambia, this is an example of working with a household level production. This is Cecilia Zulu, and she and her husband started taking on aquaculture, started an aquaculture project as an income generating project for the household. It was identified as a way that women in Zambia could participate in an income generating project or a food producing project without having to do things like go fishing in the wild. But this was an aquaculture project where they could manage their ponds. The training that they received focused also on gender issues such as access, use, and control over the benefits of their production, as well as the technical training. So initially, both were involved in the project. Both Cecilia Zulu and her husband were involved in the project, but over time he saw that she was managing it well and it was very productive and he had other things to do. And so he handed over the operation and management to his wife. And so now she is in charge of 2 ponds that the household runs, which are producing well and which have enabled her which have given her a source of income, which she has control over, and which has enabled her to send her children to school for a longer period of time and to address other household needs. And so this is again an example of leading to empowerment in the household. So what do we see as results? So if we're looking at the 5 or 6 aspects, increased production and income led to decision-making and incomes in Mali, Zambia, and Senegal. We saw in Zambia, Ghana, and Senegal that technologies and inputs did increase women's empowerment or equality, as well as their agency in this, if it was targeted to them and if they were able to access it economically, if they had the resources to buy it or to handle it or to manage it. Access to climate information specifically helped the group in Ghana. And of course, access to credit is important, but not in all cases. In Ghana, it was important because they were starting from scratch. And in Senegal, it was important for them, for their business and for the women to be able to have their own source of income, which they hadn't in those communities. Decreases in workload were key in Mali and Zambia, and increased household nutrition, in particular in Ghana, where they had started with low levels of diversity of household production. So this is not a final project. Many of these projects are continuing. They've been going for 2-3 years, so they're still kind of at the beginning. We don't have long-term analysis, although we hope that in a year or two, some of these projects will be part of a more systematic analysis through our gender, climate, and empowerment index framework, where we hope we can kind of find more quantitative results and more of the nuances. So I think that's it. I thought I had one more slide, but I can't seem to find it. So I see that my time is up, so I will stop and I'll just respond to questions. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you. Great, and we'll welcome Hossein back up for Discussants comments, and then we'll open the floor to the audience, both on Zoom and in the room.
So thank you, Sophia. And it's a pity that I don't have you here in presence, but I enjoyed a lot when I read your paper because it tells me lots of stories that I actually am experiencing also in Ethiopia, where I am active more than 10 years. I think I'm gonna make some more positive comments because we are playing the same gender climate team. By the way, so based on the thematic what you are focused, I think that's very clear that we need to raise this gender issue when it comes to climate change. Especially, you raised one very nice topic, climate smart agriculture, because climate smart agriculture is too much technology oriented, where we don't have the training, education, or even access to different resources for female farmers.
Yeah.
So to me, it's kind of, sometimes I find it very ridiculous when we introduce climate smart agriculture to some poor farmers, especially those of females. So I like the topic a lot. Let me just pass and then say that, okay, you nicely tried to combine some quantitative and qualitative measurements, and it was for me kind of learning also lesson to learn, I would say, but to integrate giving some solid recommendation, we could discuss because I understand that, okay, this is a kind of conference paper, not a scientific paper, and you have to correct me, otherwise I understand that this what you mentioned in different countries, the works were done by yourself, at least as a party by yourself. So you were more aware, what was going on than the one, for example, that I did myself as a kind of meta-analysis, because I checked the references, I see that many of these publications, you are a co-author too. So I understand that you are well aware of the work. Otherwise, okay, this could be also a question how this is done. Okay, maybe you can go to the
yeah.
And Well, when it comes to the finding, as I said, when we go for the empowering of the women, what you found also applies exactly in my study too, because limited access to different, let's say, resources, including technology, but also training could be also seen here as well. The only thing I can say is, can we go next? Okay, as I said, okay, I understand this is a kind of conference paper, so we are not going to question that much. Okay, what is the methodology, whether it's a scientific paper, whether you had a robust methodology, stuff like that. But it could be if you want to publish it, for example. There are some questions I think I already communicated them with you, so you could perhaps read them, and because they are giving me a note that I have to finish, so you can stop right here. But I guess that yeah, everything is well. I can say, okay, they said I have 1 more minute. So let's go for mostly what I really want to see is a kind of comparison study. So I mean, because there are some cases that you mentioned, okay? And each of them, they have a lesson to learn. But I wish it would be in a frame that how we could frame it in a way that we could compare different studies. I understand again that each of these studies may have different methodology or different target groups or different strategies, so that might be not that easy to compare, but nevertheless, I would be happy to see some more efforts on understanding how this could be combined and compared, and to come with perhaps some general but more specific as well recommendation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Great, thanks so much.
You can stay there because
See?
you're on
Yes,
the panel.
please.
The panel,
Okay.
the other panelists too.
Yes, Jheelum and Sophia, please do stay with us. We will now take some questions from the folks in the room and online, and then give some time for our panelists to respond. So anyone in the room with questions? Some hands to shoot up.
Thank you, Jheelum, for the paper. So I had one comment related to what the discussant also was trying to explain. So in the time use survey 2019, we have 3 divisions in the unpaid work, broad category of unpaid work, such as domestic service, caregiving, and volunteer work, etc. So I was thinking if you can bring in the 3 categories separately, then probably you will specifically be able to say which category of unpaid work you could see that, rise in hours of work. And if you could differentiate this for different categories by wealth or, caste, whatever, for the work that you wanted to do, maybe that would direct you more specifically as to what is that kind of unpaid work, that you are actually seeing the increase in. I don't know if the same thing can be applied for paid work. So based on what are the categories that is there, maybe you can think about it and we can discuss it. Thank you.
Great, we have a question in the back, and then I'd like to go to Ajit and. Oh, great.
Okay, thank you. And my comment is to Hossein, and maybe possibly to Sophia. But although one of the examples you showed is kind of supports what I'm going to say. I'm not so convinced, and this is something you did in the overview, the introduction. I'm not convinced that we can look at adaptation, resilience, and mitigation as this one, like mitigation is only macro policy and adaptation is only micro, and resilience, I don't know where you would put resilience also micro. I think it's very hard to do that. And the example about Zambia, the couple, that's a household decision, right? And that's resilience. Adaptation can be at the community level. If the community is not all into it, you're not going to see adaptation. And mitigation can actually, even though it's policy, it can also be a household level or even individual that you find your own tools to mitigation. And why is this important? As we are all, as world community thinking about what to do to save this planet, we need to get these things right, because if we get them right, then we're gonna come up with the right policies, and those policies will work anytime we have a disaster. Thank you.
Thank you. We do have a couple questions online, so maybe before we forget, we should hear them and then come back in the room.
Absolutely. A comment for Jheelum. It is a great paper. It seems that you applied DID for the district and whether the households were surveyed before and after August. I think the flood shock consists of the actual rainfall shock and the indirect effect through the physical damages. I suggest that as an extension, it would be interesting to use the rainfall data at the village level and carry out a similar analysis to identify the direct effects of rainfall shocks on the unpaid word. I think one of them was supposed to be paid. For Hossein, a question. How did you make sure the definition of the variable on the adaptation capacity / strategy comparable across different studies in your meta-analysis? And 2, when you use the Google Scholar, etc., using the keywords such as adaptation, there is a publication bias. So did you do some robustness check? Sophia, a great presentation. A question. What would be the role of men in empowering women, particularly through women's collective action, such as in the case of Senegal, where you also mentioned collective actions by men and women? Is it more effective to form the collective action only by women or both men and women?
Thank you. Ajit?
Thank you.
In there and Arun.
Quick question for Jheelum. You mentioned that climate shock can affect bargaining power in your model. How? Another question for Sophia. What is the role of state in your view? You mentioned self-help groups, savings collectives, etc. What is the role of the state, particularly, and also mobilization of men and as well as women collectively for state action to mitigate, to adapt to climate change as well as to build resilience? Thank you.
I think about your paper on coastal Kerala floods. I think the paper has everything, maybe, but not climate. In the sense that the impact of floods, what was it? What was the climate shock? Was it loss of mangroves? Was it loss of life? Was it loss of property and everything? Or impact on agriculture, salinity and grace? What was the kind of impact that you had? Or even greenhouse gases, you not mention anything at all about that. It could be anything, any other disaster happening anywhere, and you just measure paid and unpaid work. But there is no linkage with this climate at all. Again, when you talk about the impact of migration, now migration, it doesn't really mean anything unless you know why they are migrating and how they are migrating and what are the problems that they are facing. Is there any kind of adaptation or mitigation? Nothing is mentioned at all. So I think this paper should not have the title climate. You can think of any disaster or something, I suppose, if at all, that is,
Thank you. Arun?
I don't actually have a question for any one of the 3 papers, which I thought were really good, but I do have an analytical comment, which is that when we think about, I won't say climate change, I want to say the environment, the natural world. When we think about the natural world and gender, I do think that there is a common way of thinking about them, which we never think about. And that is that we focus a lot on unpaid work when we do gender, but nature also works, because what is work? Work is a flow of energy. And the work that we do, paid or unpaid, is an energy flow where we transform something. Whereas nature also is a flow of energy. Nature's work. When the water from a river irrigates a farmer's field, energy flows from the river into the soil and from there to the plants that grow and feed people. So the thing is that in that regard, there's actually a common way of thinking about nature and gender through this prism of energy. And there's lots of research on energy flows that have been done by agronomists and by social scientists. So this can actually be quantified. And that's the comment I want.
Great, Louise, I saw your hand up, do you have a quick one?
I have a very quick question for Jill. It's about it's a kind of self-interest question. It's about the representativeness of the survey data at the municipal level or at the, regional level. And because you mentioned the sample, but I'm assuming when you're mentioning the sample, you're mentioning the full sample at the national level, or if you were just there. And I just wanted to know if it is actually representative at that level, or if you used it, and if so, just to understand that. And then a general comment for the panel, because I've been thinking a lot about solutions to the climate change that has to do with gender as well. And I keep coming back to this idea that we won't necessarily find the solutions. It's about the processes of how the solutions are going to emerge. And then listening to Sophia in the last presentation, that came out very strongly, this understanding that it's community-based type of solutions that are going to bring about. It's not exactly about the empowerment of women necessarily, it's about the community working towards something. And we are here at a feminist economics kind of setting, and we've been talking a lot about as well how capitalism has actually been destroying our community powers and so on. So I don't know, I just wanted to bring that up and understand what do you think is the role of community, and how do we get out of this trap of we have less community the more advanced capitalism is, and the solutions that are being given are exactly taking us on the opposite direction. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, we do have food and wine waiting for us, so I'm going to cut us off there, though I hope the conversation continues there. I'd like to give the panelists opportunities to respond. I know this is not enough time, but if we could keep it to around 4 minutes, that'd be great. Sophia, perhaps you want to begin?
Sure. My questions are about the role of men in empowering women. So this program focuses on Africa, and I'm speaking right now personally from what I see. I'm living in Senegal right now, and so there's two different approaches. In predominantly Muslim societies, women cannot work with men that they are not related to, so they cannot work with men outside of their families. So in predominantly Muslim societies, it's women-only associations that work. For example, in Mali, there are women's associations across the country in all kinds of different sectors. And this is how women can gain some autonomy for themselves. They can gain some support from each other, and they can, combine their resources to move forward. So yes, it's important, but not necessarily in collective action. And yet there are other community approaches where men, for example, will work with the women's association. So in Senegal, the Women's Association was represented on the village environmental management committee, decision-making committee, which was predominantly men. So the organization interacted with the men, and the men on the committee interacted with the organization. That's also true in Ghana, where the Women Producers Association in the Muslim communities was made up of widows, basically, because they didn't have men who could provide for them. So they were given land by the community to provide for their own households. So this group of women work together, and then were able to have a voice in the village decision-making in the management resource committee, which was the water management committee, through their association. So there is interaction, but in different forms. And then in other countries, for example, in Zambia, there is a very large cooperative movement, and those cooperative are mixed gender. They're women and men who work together. And then finally, I think the last example of the household aquaculture is a good example of the men being involved with the women in the initial project. So they were both involved in that project, but in the end, the household decision was made that the woman would focus on the aquaculture and the man would focus on something else. And so I think you see different approaches and different ways of interacting between women and men according to the culture. And I actually think this is a really, really good topic for a paper to look at different modes of bringing men in to this gender work. You know, in some cases, it's the village decision-making committee and the village chiefs who introduce it, or who are involved, or who receive the input. In other cases, it is working with the households and having the men agree and understand what the project is, and then the household discussing among themselves. But there are different approaches. It's not as simple. And, you know, we saw yesterday the example in some villages in Malawi, where there may not be as much unity in the households necessarily, and that there are much stronger differentiation between the men's tasks and the women's tasks, and the men's domain and the women's domain. So I don't have one hard and firm solution. I think there are different strategies. In terms of the role of the state, in terms of climate resilience and adaptation, definitely the state should be making climate finance accessible at the local level. And it's not, right? Climate finance is still this really high level. How do governments get money from the Global Climate Fund and from the other organizations? But there's less discussion about how does it get from that level, the international level, down to the women and men at the grassroots at the community level. And that is a key role, and it really needs to be taken more seriously. There needs to be a lot more action around that. And the other one as well is information, climate information. Climate is changing the weather everywhere. Everywhere I go, they're saying, this is unusual weather. We don't usually get rain, or we get rain by now. There's changes in weather everywhere. And so people really need that information to be able to plan their household and their farming and their production activities and their production livelihoods. So I'll stop there because I know I'm taking quite a bit of time.
It's okay.
Those are the two ones that come to mind.
Thank you, Sophia. Same, you can squish in 4 minutes here.
Okay. First question from Mina. You mentioned micro and macro level, which one applies, and you don't agree. That okay, what we said, micro level is more, for example, for adaptation. Look, again, I say more. I didn't say only, and of course you are right. If we make that exclusion, then we cannot make it. Nevertheless, scale matters always. I mean, we have micro, meso, macro, if you consider like that. The more we go to the field, end user, individual made strategies, they are more to adaptation, because we cannot change a lot in macro level. Why? Because that incident happens right now. We should do right now something. I mean, for mitigation, it's more to the future. You are foreseeing something like installing early warning systems. Maybe you heard. In climate smart agriculture, it works actually based on early warning system. So warning system is kind of for future. So it tries to predict and warn you when it happens. The other question was from the online audience. They asked me whether the database or the methodology has some bias. I totally agree that when you go for meta-analysis, then you have to make a kind of inclusion and exclusion criteria. You cannot study everything. And the more important than bias is to mention those inclusion and exclusion criteria of what we did. For example, I said, okay, we studied only the English, let's say, written publication. So I made it clear that non-English let's say, publications are excluded. I know that this is not complete, but we cannot study everything. So more important than putting a question on the bias is to mention what you did clearly in terms of inclusion and exclusion. And of course, this work is again in progress. So we are trying to improve it. And of course, we can step by step, if we can, include more, let's say, or remove more exclusion criteria if we can. And I appreciate, Arun, you see, I love you now. You said that we have to give the value to the nature. And in fact, we do. We have already established some nice economic, let's say, methods or techniques called ecosystem valuation. And all what we do with this valuation, ecosystem gives service. Service could be like energy whatsoever that could be used by human, not only human, but also let's say flora, fauna, whatever. So before, for example, if we wanted to say that one species is endangered, we were just mentioning that species name. Now we don't talk like that to the policymaker. We say if that is, let's say, endangered and lost, then we would lose this much money. Then they understand much better. It's exactly what you are saying, because they like to, because for them, one species is one species, that's all. But when you say that you are losing this much money, for example, through land grabbing, we talked earlier today, we are losing lots of forest. And for each plot of forest, you know better than me that we need minimum 100 years to make it, while it could be removed over one night. So a lot of like the lungs of system, you are just destroying, and you are losing lots of, let's say here, money. And the last thing, if I may, okay, you can continue.
You can finish if you want.
I just wanted to reflect on the community base, what Luisa said. Totally agree. And in fact, maybe I'm not right, but I believe that more than emphasizing on gender stuff, we should go for community. Because if we believe that, okay, there is a kind of equity between male and female, you're all saying one thing. So why should we emphasize too much on that, not going for community? We should give hand in hand and solve the problem. And of course, should not be any discrimination. So to me, this community base should be even more value than what we are discussing about gender. Thank you.
Do we have comments?
Yeah, you
Take 4 minutes, yeah.
Thank you, Vijaya, for the comments. Yeah, I'm planning to look into the mechanisms by focusing on the geographical location, age group, and caste. And also regarding looking across different types of unpaid paid work. I did some analysis on like categorizing the unpaid domestic work, like focusing on exclusively the way the tenure survey has categorized what are the activities under the unpaid domestic work, unpaid care work. But I didn't include it in the analysis because I was mostly focused on like the totality of unpaid household work and labor force participation. But that's what like I was talking to you about the Duke presentation on different types of work, and also like the online comment about measuring the direct effects. So I think that's a very useful suggestion. I was trying to get access to the rainfall data from the IMD because I was not well equipped with the GIS data to extract the rainfall data. But that required some funds, and I got like $1,000 now. So I'm trying to see if I can acquire it. And coming to Ajit's comment about how climate shock affect the bargaining power. Well, first of all, I need to study more about the relationship. before commenting explicitly, but my idea is that whenever this kind of shocks happen, it influences the household dynamics, the kind of decisions that has been taken in like emergency, the decision whether a person has to spend more time in the paid work or like more obliged to take care of the household members. So this sort of behavioral aspects is the sort of mediating factor in which the climate can influence the bargaining power. But in the theoretical framework, I think I need to be more explicit about how I'm defining the Pareto weights and why I'm defining it in the bargaining power. I need to look more into it. Thank you. And as for Indira's comment, so I should have mentioned it more explicitly that the way I have incorporated the climate-related damage is by using the disaster management handbook data, and I utilized the information on the district-wide damages in terms of extreme rainfall, number of houses damaged, number of affected families by the districts, and also like cropped areas that are lost due to the floods, and also the fish farms and number of boats. So I made a composite index based on that by the districts. And based on that, I classified the districts with more than 20% damages as the affected, and the districts which have less than 20% damage as the unaffected. Because I was trying to measure the shocks, like which is basically the rainfall late, the damages. And can you please repeat the question that you?
I just want to understand the representativeness of the data when you go to the local level, because you're just using data for Kerala, right?
Yeah.
And the whole sample is for the country.
Yes, so there are data for like each districts, like some representative households and individuals from each district in India. So there are data for different states as well as like the national aggregates you can make.
I think she's asking whether it's the data is representative at the district level.
Yes.
Right.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
That's the point.
Yes. So yeah. So what I tried to look for that is like for each sub-rounds, whether for each district for the region I focused, whether there is data available for like is it covering like its sub-rounds? And that's why some of the districts are not covered. For instance, in case of Kerala, Idukki is the district that was not represented in the second sub-round, and I excluded it from the analysis. So for instance, another case study I was looking at was for Bihar, which had like 38 districts, but nearly 8 to 10 districts I had to drop out because it had only information in the second sub-round, but not in the first and third remaining sub-rounds.
Thank you. I think we need to wrap up. Ajit has a comment.
I want to thank each and every one of you for being here. Some who have traveled far, some who traveled from close by, but still, it's great that we could be here for 3 days, exploring ideas, getting to meet new people, seeing old friends again, familiar faces. I know that some of you have been around from the first iteration of this workshop, and even before. We have our collaborations and our exchange of ideas have begun. And I have to say that I've truly learned a lot from all those interactions in the past and this time. But now I have to thank the people who actually made this possible this time. And the first round of hands should go to Ashima. Was the energy behind the workshop in putting together the program and bringing together the participants, all of us here in this room, deciding who is going to come, deciding what the makeup of papers are to be. She played the lead role in that. So that's why the first person to congratulate is her. And we did a wonderful job. Next, I'd like to thank our student volunteers here, Shane, Brandon, time is, I can. And also, they were not here today, right, Emily and Emma and, yeah, they didn't, yeah, but still they too. And then our wonderful staff and our other support, Belle, who's played a key role here.